I've been driving 18-wheelers for the better part of 15 years now, and all my time on the highways and byways of this great nation of ours, I've only seen one thing that's ever really scared me. I'm not saying that I'm hardcore or something. I've had plenty of things make me anxious or nervous, and I sure do a whole lot of worrying when I'm out there in the great unknown all on my lonesome. But only one single solitary thing that I can safely say terrified me. I was driving through South Dakota hauling lumber down Highway 73, and out there is some of the most barren, featureless land you could ever have the misfortune of seeing. Don't get me wrong, I love this state. It's home and it'll always be my home. But sometimes you just want something to look at while you're driving, you know? Anyway, I'm driving down this particularly empty stretch of 75, a place where you can see for miles and miles in every direction, just all horizons as far as the eye can see, when suddenly, I see something on the side of the road. I couldn't tell exactly what it was until I was maybe a few hundred meters away, but it looked an awful lot like a guy crouching over something that was lying at the roadside. It looked like he was picking something up off the ground and bringing it up to his face, and it was only as I passed them that I realized what was going on. The thing that was lying on the ground was a piece of roadkill. I don't know if it was a deer or antelope or whatever you want to call it. In fact, I'm not exactly sure what kind of animal it was. I just know that the hands and face of whoever was leaning over it were covered in blood. They were eating that piece of roadkill, and it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. I just have no idea why. I've had people ask me why I didn't stop to see what the person's deal was, but I always turn the question around on them and ask if they'd want to stop their truck in the middle of nowhere to talk to someone who was eating dead animal. Apart from the occasional tough guy who lies through their teeth and claims that they'd have gotten out with a gun to play 20 questions or whatever, the answer is always the same. No. I've had a few fairly reasonable suggestions to explain what I was looking at, and some not too reasonable ones too. Some of the less believable range from Bigfoot to Wolfman to the zombie apocalypse. Some people have seen too many movies, but I actually buy one of the more legit suggestions. We have a few weirdo survivalist enclaves out here in South Dakota, one of which is the old military base turned survivalist compound in the Black Hills that they call X Point. You have to have a fair amount of scratch stashed away to buy one of those bunkers, but I've heard people really do live there. People that have half lost their minds anyways. It could have been someone like that, eating the roadkill. Someone with too much money and not enough brains who had decided to train themselves for the end of the world. But I can almost guarantee that by eating raw roadkill like that, the only thing they'd be preparing for is their own grave. I use quite a sophisticated GPS system in my truck, meaning I'm able to track and review my journeys in some pretty amazing detail. So when I had enough bars on my cell phone, I called 911 to let them know that there was some crazy person eating roadkill along 73, and passed on the rough location of where I'd spotted them. I didn't do it to be a narc or anything. I mainly did it because whoever it was obviously needed some serious help. That and the obvious danger they posed to any regular people who might be unfortunate enough to bump into them while they're in the mood to eat raw roadkill. I just can't imagine what would possess anyone to do something like that. I mean, how close to insanity or desperation do you have to be to just shovel some dead animal's raw guts into your mouth like that? I later had an uncle tell me about feral humans, like this one girl who escaped her abusive parents in the 70s, and when the authorities found her, she was growling like a dog or something. He thought maybe the guy was like that, just totally feral, and had maybe just adapted to eating raw meat like that. I'll file that one under one of the less believable explanations, and the truth is, I don't really think I want to know what was going through their head. Forgive me for commandeering someone else's story here, but I think it's very relevant to the thread, and although my father wasn't a trucker, this incident closely involves someone who was. Back in the 70s, my dad was an 18-year-old gas station attendant at a 24-hour gas station. One night, Dad was the only one working the late shift when One of the sketchiest customers he'd ever laid eyes on walks into the station. My dad said it was really obvious that the guy was concealing something in his pants, and his first thought, which brings on some major panic, is that the guy has a gun on him. Now, a whole lot of truck drivers used to use his station for two reasons. Number one, it had a pretty roomy parking lot which they'd use to take naps and breaks in, and number two, it was the only place for miles around that they could get a bite to eat. Usually, there could have been up to 10 truckers parked up in the lot, but on this particular night, there was only one truck there. Luckily, though, the guy just so happened to be in the store with my dad, but since Dad didn't know if he was armed or what kind of guy he was, he figured he was still pretty vulnerable. The weird guy starts walking up and down the rows in the store, and my dad can tell he's not really looking at anything. Most customers either come in to pay for their gas or went straight to the hot food counter to pick out something to eat. Weird guy looks like he's just biding his time before he pulls out his gun and robs the store. At least that's what's going through my dad's head. The trucker comes up to the counter while this is happening, puts down a bag of chips, and just so happens to look over his shoulder at the sketchy guy. Then, this moment of pure understanding occurs. The trucker looks at the sketchy guy, then looks at my dad, then back and forth maybe once or twice more, then asks my dad what was supposed to sound like a totally random question. He says something like, "Quiet night, huh? I wouldn't feel safe working at a gas station alone. You keep a gun behind the counter there or something?" All my dad had was a bat, and even so, it belonged to the station's owner, but the trucker widens his eyes and mimes a nod at my dad, who suddenly realizes what he's supposed to say in reply. "Oh yeah," he says. "I got a 45 right here. Always just in arms like the way." The trucker continues to play along and bangs his fist on the counter before kind of shielding the action with his body. "Oh yeah?" he says. "Well, check this out. 357 Magnum. Bought it after I saw that movie, Dirty Harry. Not as big a bullet as your 45, but it sure does pack a punch. Some days I just pray some SOB mess with me so I can blow his freaking head off." Right as he says that, the sketchy guy just makes a beeline for the door, gets back into his car, then zooms off down the highway. When the guy had left, the trucker turns back to my dad and says something along the lines of, "You know that guy was about to rob you, right? I was going to take a nap out back, but I think I'm more in the mood for coffee after that. Oh, and do yourself a favor. Call the cops." My dad says he always figured guardian angels would be all cherubic, half-naked winged ladies that descend playing harps or whatever. He didn't figure they came in the form of some hairy trucker who smelled like he hadn't showered in 3 days. But as he puts it, every day is a school day. The guy spent the entire rest of his break hanging around the store, making conversation with my dad until the cops showed up and my dad could file a report. The trucker confirmed the story too, backing my dad up when he said it looked like the sketchy guy had a gun stuffed in the back of his pants. Then get this, right in the middle of talking to the cops, both of their radios start buzzing, and they run out of the gas station, get into the patrol car, and speed off down the highway with their lights and sirens on. The trucker responds, "I hope our friend and his gun didn't find the trouble they were looking for." Only, they had. My dad said he read in the newspaper the next day that the very same guy, based on the description in the paper, had walked into another gas station about 10 miles down the highway. But unlike my dad, the clerk in that station hadn't been so lucky. The guy was the actual owner and operator of the station, tried to resist the robbery, and ended up paying with his life. From what my dad could tell, the sketchy guy pulled his gun, the station owner went for his, and the sketchy guy just pulled the trigger. Boom. Killed him behind his own counter. Now, my dad obviously didn't have a gun, but he said he was panicking just watching the guy walking around the store. If that was him getting robbed by someone with such an itchy trigger finger, he might have made a wrong move or something, and bam. I literally wouldn't even be around today to write this. I think the sketchy guy ended up getting the death penalty too. That, or died in some shootout with the cops. Maybe even the same cops who attended my dad's call. I can't quite remember which, but Dad always mentions him getting what he deserved whenever he tells the story. Now, I don't have to tell you how glad I am of that too, because even though it's so surreal to me, the idea of someone actually hurting my dad is just on a whole other kind of rage that I would feel. Dad's story doesn't just give me a belief in guardian angels, even if they do appear in unconventional forms, but it also makes me believe that there might just be something like divine justice, too. I'm not a long-haul trucker, and I don't drive an 18-wheeler, but I do drive a flatbed truck that makes deliveries around my home state of Maine. And more importantly, I definitely have a creepy story to share with you guys. This one night back in the winter of 2008, I was driving down this dark stretch of road in the late evening, and with it being winter, it was dark out. I'm driving between towns too, and some stretches of road out here barely have lights on them. I can only see what my headlights are lighting up, so imagine how scared I was when suddenly they pick up a guy just standing right in the middle of the road. I had to swerve to miss him, and I swear I only just missed the guy. Put it this way, I passed so close to him that I could tell the guy's eyes were closed as I passed him. Yeah, that close. And that wasn't the only detail I noticed about the guy. Not only was he dressed entirely in white, but he looked like he had some kind of white makeup all over his face and head too. The guy was bald, and he had this same bright white skin tone all over. The second I came to a stop, I jumped out of my truck and ran back to see if he was okay. I mean, I was still worried I might have clipped him on the way past or something, because, like I said, I must have been just inches from smashing this guy. But as I ran back just a few feet, I noticed the road was completely empty. I've had people say to me, "Oh, it's definitely a ghost." And let me tell you, it wasn't a friggin' ghost. Not that I don't believe in all that stuff, more like I heard the guy running off through a field at the side of the road. I didn't see him run, but I could 100% hear him running. I don't know what in God's name he was thinking, if it was some weird attempt at taking his own life or what, but Jesus Christ, am I glad I didn't hit him, because I think that would have messed me up for the rest of my life. Way back when I was like 8 or 9 years old, I remember talking to my dad about religion and God and stuff. At one point in the conversation, I have this really vivid memory of a question I asked and the answer he gave me. The question was something like, "Do angels really exist?" And his answer was something along the lines of this: "Before I was born, before Mom and him were even an item, my dad used to drive trucks for a living. And this is way back before labor laws were strict about brakes or mile limits, so Dad would sometimes take jobs that would require him to drive for maybe 24 or maybe 36 hours straight. So, this one particular night, after having already driven for a really long time, he noticed his eyelids getting heavier and heavier as he got sleepier and sleepier. Even worse, any attempt to wake himself up just didn't seem to be working. He chugged down the rest of his coffee, tried blasting himself with cold air from the AC, but nothing did the trick. He says he remembers passing mile marker 146, and since he had this straight stretch of road in front of him, he decided to rest his eyes and take a deep breath for maybe only 2 seconds tops. Then the next thing he knows, he feels his head do the nod jerk thing, which woke him up with a gasp. He opened his eyes to see that he was driving straight toward mile marker 158, which was right up against some ravine-type thing. If he had woken up a second later, he and his whole truck would have plummeted down the ravine, and he'd have surely been killed. But because he came to at that exact moment, he was able to safely course-correct. He says if the difference between life and death came down to literally just a second, I actually wouldn't even exist right now. Once he stopped, he just pulled into the side of the road first chance he could and did the math on the whole thing. He said he must have slept through miles of driving down perfectly straight highway, doing anything between 50, only to wake up right at the moment he needed to in order to save his own skin. It was a really long-winded way of saying that he didn't actually know if angels really existed, but he sure believed they did. Either that, or there was some kind of force in the universe that woke him up just as he reached mile marker 158, right at the exact split second that he needed to. Because as I already said, if he'd nodded off a millisecond later, or nodded himself awake a millisecond later, I wouldn't be writing this right now. I just want to start off by saying what a huge fan of your channel I am. I drive trucks for a living, and most of my journeys are long haul, which means I have plenty of time to just sit in my cab doing a whole lot of nothing. As you can probably guess, it gets really, really boring, and if it wasn't for all the videos you put out, I think I'd have gone straight up crazy by now. I don't really have a lot of free time whenever I'm home, so it's taken me way longer to write this than maybe it should. But I've been meaning to share something that happened to me with you for the longest time now, and I think it'd be awesome to hear one of my own experiences on one of your videos. So, a few years ago, I was cruising west at about 70 on the I-76 just outside of Denver, Colorado. It had been a pretty boring haul up until that point. I mean, Colorado was pretty and all, but the whole drive had been completely uneventful. The weather had been great. There had been nothing to slow me down, and I was starting to think the whole ride would carry on without a hitch. But then, out of nowhere, I see this huge, almost solid cloud of dirt coming over the horizon. It had to be at least 20 to 30 feet wide, completely covering the road ahead, and it was at least as tall as my truck's cab, so maybe 12 to 15 feet tall. At first, I had no idea what I was looking at. Could have been a vehicle fire or something, but then I couldn't see the smoke billowing from anywhere, and I couldn't see any car or truck either. Then I figured it might have been like a dust storm or something, but a dust storm that's only 30 feet wide? It couldn't be. I didn't have any way of dodging it, so I just slowed down, hit the washers, then just prayed that there wasn't any rocks getting whipped up that might smash my windshield. I'm an owner and operator too, so any damage, and it's my insurance, not some company's. Seconds later, wham! I hit it, and the noise in my cab was seriously loud. That's what set it apart from a regular dust storm. They just don't make that kind of noise. Then the second thing that set it apart from a dust storm was the mess it left on my windshield. Because as I hit the mass of it, whatever it was, everything that hit my windshield left a smear of what looked like some kind of juice on the glass. That's when I worked out what I was driving into. It was bees. All these freaking huge bees that seriously sounded like rocks when they were slamming into my cab. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. I mean, I'd seen giant swarms of locusts on TV before, but bees, I didn't think they even swarmed like that. Two things really creeped me out about the whole thing, and not so much all the bee guts on my windshield either, because I'm not a particularly squeamish person. The first thing was how, if I'd have just been walking at the side of the road, those things might have actually killed me. A couple of hundred bee stings could easily kill a person, so I've read anyway, and if they're aggressive when they're in that swarming state, that'd have been the end of me. But then the second thing, and the thing that stuck with me long after I passed through the swarm, was the idea that they'd been flying like that to avoid some epic natural disaster or something. And for the next few miles, I found myself getting really anxious, half expecting to feel an earthquake or see a meteor falling from the sky or something. Obviously, nothing like that happened, thank God, but the first chance I could, I looked up giant bee swarms on Google to see if they were actually a thing. Obviously they are, but ones that size are an extremely rare event. When I told another trucker about the whole thing recently, he told me I was lucky to see something like that, like it was some kind of natural wonder or something. But let me tell you, I didn't feel so lucky to be driving through it at the time. I was driving my 18-wheeler on this long-haul stretch one time when I suddenly needed to pee real bad. I figured I'd just wait for a gas station or something, but after maybe 5 or 10 minutes of driving, there was no sign of any, and no signs to tell me if I was close to one or not. So, to save from soaking my drawers, I decided to pull over and take a leak at the side of the road. It was incredibly dark outside, and although the side of the road I stopped on had a bunch of woods in it, I'll admit it was way too spooky for me to just wander off into the dark. And being as dark as it was, I figured I'd be able to just put my hazard lights on and take a few steps to the side before whipping it out. Then right as I'm peeing, I hear something running through the trees toward me. I mean, whatever it was pounding dirt as it came at me. I couldn't see a freaking thing, and it scared the life out of me even more, so I tried to stop peeing and put my junk away, then just bolted back to my truck cab as quickly as I could. I half expected whatever it was to slam itself up against the door of my truck, and since I keep a gun in my glove box, first thing I did was grab it, and then aim it right towards the window, getting ready to blast the first thing I saw. It felt like I was lying there on the seat for like half an hour, but in reality it was maybe only a minute or two, and absolutely nothing appeared at the window or banged up against the door of my truck. I know it was dumb of me, but I spent the next few minutes looking out of the driver's side window checking for whatever it was I heard running, but again, I didn't see anything. That was about the same time I realized that I hadn't actually stopped peeing when I thought I did, and in the process of putting it away and diving into my truck, I soaked the entirety of my pants and seat. I spent the next few miles driving back buck naked from the waist down, with my pants slung over the air conditioner trying to dry them before the next rest stop. Definitely one of my worst nights ever on the job, and for more than one reason, too. So this might not be the most terrifying story y'all have ever heard, but I'm pretty sure you'll understand why I found this so creepy. I drive trucks for a living, and this one morning I'm cruising down this stretch of highway during the summer. It was early enough for the sun to be up and incredibly bright, and when I come around this one bend in the road, all I see in front of me, on the blacktop, was blood. Blood, guts, crushed bones, and fur. I mean, it was a massacre out there. There must have been like 100 small animals bleeding all over the road for maybe a quarter mile. And I ain't never seen anything like that in my life. Looked like the set of a horror movie or something. Later I found out that some science place had been raided by animal rights protesters or something, who let out all these minks or ferrets or whatever in the middle of the night. The poor things booked it through a forest, across a field, and then onto a busy stretch of highway. Boom, boom, boom. They're running back and forth, getting crushed by cars. Must have been a few of them coming thick and fast, because I can't see how they got so many at one time before all of them things just scattered and got their butts off the road. But good God, I suppose the road to hell really is paved with good intentions. From 1975 to 1990, the American Southlands were stalked by one of the most abhorrent and vicious killers the country has ever known. He is thought to have tortured, violated, and murdered more than 50 different women and girls during his grotesque 15-year spree. And while many other killers would have been apprehended long before they reached such body count, the secret to this killer's success was his mobility. You see, not only was he constantly on the move using his 16-wheeler truck, but he also converted his soundproofed sleeper cab into a veritable torture chamber. This is the story of Robert Ben Rhodes, perhaps better known as the Truck Stop Killer. Born on November 22nd of 1945 in Council Bluffs, Iowa, Rhodes' formative years set him apart from most serial killers due to their relative normalcy. Although his father was a serving soldier in West Germany until his elementary school years, Rhodes' childhood seems to be objectively stable and wholesome. He was never abused, he never acted out, and by his teenage years, whatever trouble he got into is generally characteristic of a regular angsty teen. He was active and outgoing during his high school years, taking part in sports such as football and wrestling. He even regularly attended the Thomas Jefferson High School French Club and was apparently a rather proficient francophone. The aforementioned trouble involved juvenile arrests for public fighting and vehicle tampering, but I'm sure we can all agree that very few young men make it through their teenage years without getting into the occasional scuffle. It seems that darkness only entered Rhodes's life in 1964, the same year he enlisted in the U.S. Marines. It was around this time that his father was suddenly arrested by Council Bluffs police, and the local community was stunned when they learned it was on charges of inappropriately touching a 12-year-old girl. Then, just when it seemed that the situation couldn't get any worse, Rhodes's father took his own life before he could be tried. Following his father doing so, Rhodes entered something of a downward spiral, and his military conduct worsened to the point where, in 1968, he was dishonorably discharged from the military for his involvement in a violent robbery. During the years that followed, Rhodes's existence was marred by his inability to settle into any kind of routine lifestyle. He briefly attended college, but quickly dropped out. He then applied to join the Council Bluffs police force, but had his application rejected due to his dishonorable discharge from the military. He subsequently found work in a variety of stores, supermarkets, warehouses, and restaurants, marrying and divorcing 3 different women in the process. One of these women, Deborah, recalls that Rhodes became horribly abusive once the flame of their romance burned out, and she found herself constantly rebuffing his attempts to introduce sadistic and masochistic activities to their relationship. Eventually, Rhodes found a form of employment that he could finally settle on, one that would take him far away from Iowa, all the pain, torment, and shame, and of his father's despicable inclinations: long-haul trucking. Rhodes later stated that he had been preying on hitchhikers and truck stop escorts since the mid-1970s, but due to his mobility, he didn't come to the attention of authorities until 1990. It was in January of that year that Rhodes happened across a husband and wife hitchhiker couple named Patricia Walsh and Douglas Sikowski. Patricia and Douglas had been hitchhiking across the state of Texas and, by all accounts, had experienced a pleasant journey thus far. They had no reason to be suspicious of Rhodes, who seemed perfectly affable when he first stopped to pick them up. Yet shortly after they continued along the highway, the couple's nightmare began in earnest. It's not clear how Douglas was murdered, but when his body was found in Texas's Sutton County, it would not be positively identified until 2 years later. In the week that followed her husband's murder, Patricia Walsh was kept alive for 7 long days before she was finally killed. In that time, police suspect she was essentially used as a pleasure slave, kept bound and gagged in Rhodes's soundproof sleeper cab, and repeatedly tortured until he grew bored of her. Her body was then dumped in Millard County, Utah, and by the time her body found its way onto a coroner's table, she was barely recognizable. A month later, Rhodes snatched 18-year-old Shauna Holtz from the side of the highway, bundling her into his makeshift torture chamber, where she was tortured and kept prisoner for around 2 weeks. Miraculously, Shayna managed to escape captivity and immediately rushed to inform law enforcement of her harrowing ordeal. She gave the police a detailed description of both Rhodes and the truck he was driving, and this led to the speedy detention of her attacker. However, when faced with actually pressing charges against Rhodes, Shayna suddenly began to have second thoughts. She told investigating police officers that she didn't think a jury would believe her story, and even when assured that the mountain of evidence would ensure a conviction, she refused to appear in court. "I don't see any good in filing charges," she said on record. "It's just going to be my word against his. If there was any evidence, I would file charges and sue him." Shayna was once again shown the massive amounts of collated evidence and was told not a jury in the land would decline to convict Rhodes of his heinous and brutal actions, but still, she declined a court appearance. It's now believed that Shayna found the combination of fear and trauma to be completely and utterly psychologically overwhelming. She may have believed that, if cleared of the charges, that Rhodes would hunt her down to subject her to more of the same awful treatment. And if he did, she might not be fortunate enough to escape for a second time. 2 weeks after the kidnapping charges against Rhodes were dropped, two teenage runaways named Ricky Lee Jones and Regina K. Walters were attempting to hitchhike out of the Houston suburb of Pasadena. Rhodes spotted them, put on his facade of friendliness, and as the young couple climbed into the cab of his truck, their fate was sealed. Just like with Patricia Walsh and Douglas Sikowski, Ricky Lee Jones was murdered almost straight away, with his body being found on March 3rd of 1991 in Lamar County, Mississippi, whereas Walters was told she'd suffer the same fate unless she complied. The kidnapping of Regina K is perhaps the most viscerally disturbing of Rhodes's murders, because in this case, there exists actual photographical evidence of his victim's final moments. The police would later seize photographs from Rhodes's home that depicted Regina Walters and other victims being forced to stand and sit in painful stress positions. These photographs are extremely disturbing as the horror etched into their faces is palpable. In Regina's case, the images show her having differing hair lengths with a variety of different bruises, suggesting that she had been held captive for a very long time, possibly even months. In addition to physical abuse and psychological torture Regina was subjected to, Robert Ben Rhodes chose to cruelly taunt Regina's father in a series of anonymous phone calls. In the months after he kidnapped her, Rhodes would call his home or office and say things like, "I made some changes. I cut her hair." During one phone call, Regina's father asked Rhodes to at least tell him if his daughter was alive or not. Rhodes reportedly responded with, "Oh, she's alive all right. I've left her hung up in a barn somewhere, but you'll never find her." It was a lie. By the time the phone call was made, Regina was dead, killed in a manner which is almost too sickening to recount. On the day of her execution, Regina was taken to a derelict piece of farmland where there existed a rotting, dilapidated shack. Rhodes had cut her long, flowing curls short, forced her into a long black dress and heels, then told her to pose as if he was about to attack her. The photos Ben Rhodes took of her that day are easy to find online, and it's possible that she was assured that she would be safe if she only complied with the request. It was a lie. Once Rhodes had finished taking photographs of Regina in her meek and awkward poses, he wrapped a piece of metal wire around her neck, then strangled the life out of her. Thankfully, Rhodes would be apprehended a short while later, denying him the chance to kill again. But it was undeniably a frighteningly close call for his latest prospective victim. On the early morning of April 1st, 1990, Arizona Highway Patrol Trooper Mike Miller discovered a truck with its hazard lights on at the side of the interstate. Deciding to stop to see if the driver needed any assistance, Miller parked his patrol car at the edge of the road, then got out to investigate. When he drew level with the truck's sleeper cab, he heard a faint sound coming from inside. Then when he opened the small hatch, he was greeted by an ear-splitting scream. Inside was a naked and bloodied Kathleen Vine, whose arms were restrained by a pair of handcuffs which had been grafted to the ceiling of the sleeper cab. When Rhodes emerged from the driver's seat of the truck, he told the horrified trooper Miller that he had simply found Kathleen at the side of the highway like that and was in the process of seeking help for her. Thankfully, Miller didn't buy Rhodes' ruse, and the officer drew his gun on him, disarming and arresting him in the process. It was only when Rhodes was in police custody that a homicide detective was able to connect him to a string of disappearances across America's southern states. And not long after, a charge of murder was added to an already extensive list of offenses, including aggravated assault and unlawful imprisonment. It wasn't until 1994 that Rhodes was convicted of the murder of Regina K. Walters, and as punishment, he was sentenced to life without parole at Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois. Just over a decade later, he was extradited to Utah to be tried for the deaths of Candace Walsh and Douglas Sikowski, but charges were dropped after the families of the victims claimed that testifying in court would be far too painful to bear. They were reassured that Rhodes was about to be extradited to Texas to be tried for the murder of Ricky Lee Jones, and in this case, Rhodes pleaded guilty to his death in exchange for a second life sentence, ensuring he would never again see the light of day. Rhodes is now 76 years old and is still detained at the Menard Maximum Security Prison. But although he has previously claimed as many as 50 victims, authorities have said it's unlikely he'll ever stand trial again. That means it's impossible to know just how many missing people Rhodes is responsible for, and that there are scores of family across Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Utah who will never truly know what happened to their loved ones. It's also not entirely clear why Rhodes chose to kill in the first place. Perhaps it all stems from the anger and shame he felt regarding his father's deviance and eventually him taking his own life, that killing the innocent was his way of getting back at the world that he felt had wronged him while he was still in the prime of his life. The only thing we know for certain is that Rhodes was imbued with a rare, distilled variety of evil that led him not only to torture those he would go on to kill, but also to reach out and torture their families as well. It was a foggy Saturday night on July 25th of 1953 when 30-year-old interstate trucker Lester Woodward pulled into an unlit gravel parking lot to get a few hours of sleep. It was something Woodward had done 100 times before as he drove along the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and common practice among long-haul truckers to lessen their exhaustion and lower the chances of serious traffic accidents. The next morning, a fellow trucker found himself lost on the same stretch of highway, and upon seeing Woodward's truck still parked in the same secluded spot, he decided to pull in to ask directions. When he drew level with Woodward's cab, he saw the man slumped against the dashboard and called out to stir him from his slumber. Woodward didn't respond, and that's when the lost trucker noticed the single bullet hole near the man's hairline. Woodward had been executed with a single bullet, fired from a .32 caliber revolver. Police speculated the killer had quietly pulled his own vehicle into the secluded parking lot before stealthily mounting the truck's cab to fire the fatal shot. They also suspected that his speedy getaway had caused a 6-car pileup nearby, one of which had caused several others to lose their lives that night. Since Woodward's wallet was completely empty, police suspected that the murder was little more than a violent robbery. But just 3 days later, the shooting of another trucker would suggest that the killer's motive was considerably more sinister. 30 miles east of the spot Lester Woodward was murdered, 39-year-old Harry Pitts took a break from making stops for the Baker Drive-Away Company when he pulled into a similarly isolated parking lot to catch some shut-eye. The following morning, a coworker of Pitts spotted his rig sitting idle in the lot and pulled up alongside him to shoot the breeze. The sight that greeted him was truly horrifying. While he slumbered, Pitt had been shot through the mouth, leaving a gruesome gaping wound in his cheek. The bullet had then ripped through his neck, severing his spinal cord and killing him instantly. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the bullet was a .32 caliber round fired by the same revolver that had killed Lester Woodward. Tire tracks suggested that following Pitt's execution, the killer had screeched away from the scene of the crime, much in the same manner as he had the previous one. However, in this case, there was no signs of robbery, as all of Pitt's valuables were left on his person. This was down to one of two possibilities. Either the killer had been interrupted while rifling through Pitt's pockets to retrieve his wallet, or robbery was never his intention in the first place. The latter left police with a horrifying prospect, and when no witnesses came forward to confirm they'd stumbled across the crime scene, it was all but confirmed. When news of the killings reached the ears of truckers in the region, it terrified them. The idea that such a monster would randomly target them while they were at their most vulnerable was almost too much to bear, and truckers began taking certain precautions in order to remain safe. They armed themselves with firearms and melee weapons, and began traveling in pairs or in whole convoys to deter any potential attackers. When the time came to sleep, terrified truckers piled into the parking lots of diners or service stations, and although many a joke was made regarding their circling of the wagons, the fear among them was deadly serious. Some refused to believe that something so horrifying was occurring, and suggested the victims were deliberately targeted. "I think it's a guy with a grudge," one told a reporter. "Maybe he got the wrong guy the first time and then went back to get the right one the second time. I just can't make any sense that he'd go around shooting just anybody." Yet the very next day, law enforcement announced a very different theory. "There was a maniac loose on the turnpike," said one homicide detective, following the shooting of yet another trucker in Ohio. Terror gripped the turnpike, and an increased number of highway patrol officers kept watch along the roads. They were tasked with waking all lone slumbering drivers, sometimes telling them to move along, other times just to make sure that they'd not been executed. As expected, the media jumped on the story, capitalizing on the mortal fears of truckers everywhere as they dubbed the mysterious killer the Turnpike Phantom. Victim number 3 was 36-year-old John Shepard, and just like the other victims, he was shot dead in the cab of his truck as he slept by the roadside. Yet miraculously, Shepard survived the attack and would later participate in a press interview from the hospital bed he was recovering in. "A noise like a firecracker went off in my head, and I reared up and yelled for my mother. I thought I was at home," he told reporters. Somehow the bullet intended to kill him had merely shattered his jaw. Then as he attempted to stem the bleeding, he heard a high-pitched male voice call out to him from outside. "I'm out of gas, I need money," the voice said. At the time, Shepard didn't even realize he'd been shot and assumed that he'd been hit with something in the course of being robbed. He handed over his wallet and his watch, then heard the assailant speed off in his car. After the bullet was removed from Shepard's jaw, ballistic analysts determined it had been fired from the same weapon that killed Woodward and Pitts. The Turnpike Phantom had struck again. Determined to catch their culprit, law enforcement threw the book at just about anyone who drew suspicion. They tried to pin the murders on recently married couple who had financed their cross-country honeymoon by robbing truckers, but the case fell apart. Then there was the businessman with the .22 caliber automatic in his trunk, but the caliber didn't match the one used in the murders. 3 Florida gangsters were then arrested on suspicion of the killings, but each had an alibi covering the nights in question. Following the arrest, several terrified truck drivers reported being followed by a man in a car, but each time the police rushed to the scene, they discovered the man had vanished. However, it's not clear if there really was anyone following the drivers, as it may have been the case that a deep paranoia had set in among the region's truckers. During the month that followed, and despite the many roadblocks set up by various highway patrol units, little progress was made on the case. The Pennsylvania Truck Motor Association even offered today's equivalent of $118,000 in reward money for any information leading to the Phantom's capture, but the bounty failed to generate a single usable lead. It wasn't until early October of 1953 that there was a serious break in the case, and it came in the form of John Shepard's stolen watch showing up in a Cleveland pawn shop. The owner of the shop had been given a detailed description of the item and immediately contacted police when he determined it was the same piece. Luckily, the man who pawned it had been foolish enough to give the shop owner his real name, and it wasn't long before the man was traced to a rooming house in the very same town he'd pawned the watch. When the police arrived at the rooming house and demanded to be shown the room of one John Wesley Wable, they were told he had vanished. However, John had left behind a 22-year-old girlfriend, Leora Chrissy, who told police she'd been given a very unusual going-away present, a .32 caliber revolver. It was the exact same revolver that had been used in the truck ambushes. After doing some research into Wable's background, police discovered he was an unemployed factory worker who had been fired from his job back in March. Despite Wable having no history of violent crime, they were frustrated to learn that he had been arrested on August 6th, mere miles from the scene of Woodward's murder, for failing to return a rental car on time. The cops actually had him in custody until September 23rd, when Wable's father settled the claim with the car dealer, convincing him to drop the case in the process. Their frustration doubled when they discovered that, while being held in the county jail, Wable had actually admitted to being the Turnpike Phantom. Yet his confession was dismissed by skeptical jailers who viewed it as nothing but a baseless attempt to gain clout, and he was subsequently set free. October 9th of 1953 saw a nationwide manhunt for Wable begin. The following day, a New Mexico State patrolman spotted a stolen car near Isleta, a small town just 10 miles south of Albuquerque. Inside it were 3 men, each wanted in connection with the robbery of an Albuquerque gas station, and one of these men happened to be John Wesley Wable. With the police in hot pursuit, Wable and his 2 sidekicks raced off at speeds exceeding 100 miles an hour, crashing through 2 police roadblocks in the process. By the time police caught up with the car, Wable had fled on foot. A short time later, an off-duty nurse named Carolyn Smith spotted a hitchhiker walking toward a local homeless camp near the Santa Fe railroad track. By that point, Wable had garnered nationwide notoriety for his crimes, and many were familiar with his physical description. Smith also noted that the man seemed extremely agitated, and on a hunch, she reported the sighting to local police. Upon his arrest, Wable insisted that he was completely innocent of the murders. He admitted to being the owner of the murder weapon, but claimed that a friend of his named Jim Parks had borrowed the gun just a week before the killing began. There was no evidence that such a man even existed, but Wable insisted on sticking to his story throughout his short trial. However, he did end up admitting to being at the scene of John Shepard's shooting, but said it was Parks who had shot the man before stealing his watch. Wable's father swore that his son was tucked in bed at the time of the murders, but the prosecution's arguments were strong to say the least. Then, after just 4 hours of jury deliberation, their verdict was read before the court. Guilty, they said. First degree, recommended sentence, death penalty. Wable had been condemned to ride the lightning. On September 26th of 1955, John Wesley Wable was executed via the electric chair. The man was gone, but his legacy remained. Wable's terrifying murder spree forever changed the habits of long-haul truckers everywhere, and since then, truck drivers have congregated en masse at crowded, well-lit rest stops in order to get their much-needed sleep. A trucker might not believe in ghosts or spirits, but there's no denying that they're haunted by the frightening memory of John Wesley Wable. Some serial killers are caught entirely by accident, some after long and tiresome investigations. Yet there is a special breed of multiple murderers whose careers creating cadavers comes to an end when they hand themselves into the police, and one of those is Wayne Adam Ford. Born on December 3rd of 1961, Ford was born the second son of an American father and German mother in Petaluma, California. Ford's personal problems began when he was just 10 years old, with his parents' messy divorce having a deeply adverse psychological effect on him. After just a few years of high school, Ford dropped out and enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he served for 6 years before receiving an honorable discharge in 1985. It was an amicable split, as increasing psychological decline necessitated several stints in psychiatric hospitals. He grew to hate the Marine lifestyle, and the Corps had no interest in holding on to someone with increasingly dangerous deviancies. Ford went through 2 marriages, both of which ended in divorce, and like many others who failed to settle into any kind of set routine or lifestyle, he became a long-haul trucker to make ends meet. It was during his career as a trucker that he began to have scrapes with the law, but nothing ever seemed to stick. In just a few years, Ford was accused of beating and robbing an escort and several other incidents of vicious violence and animal cruelty. But no one could have suspected just how evil and deranged he truly was. Finally, on November 3rd of 1998, Ford walked into the Humboldt County Sheriff Department in Eureka, California, and told the deputy on the front desk that they needed to arrest him. When asked why they needed to arrest him, Ford simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a Ziploc bag containing the severed breast of one of his victims. He then told a gathering of horrified deputies that he had murdered 4 women between October of 1997 and November of 1998. Following this confession, he was swiftly arrested and detained. For some reason, Even with Ford's detailed confession, it took until June of 2006 to find him guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. His haunting handiwork was so utterly harrowing that, even with a guilty plea, Ford was sentenced to death for his crimes. He's currently on the death row of California's San Quentin State Prison, but thanks to the moratorium on executions in California, he is unlikely to go the way of his victims anytime soon. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, why do cows be so jacked?